So this message is called Starting to Understand. Last week was Still Not Understanding. So we're going from still not understanding to starting to understand. So you see a progression here. As we think about the passage that was read by Bill, we're going to be looking at a bit today at sight. And I know from personal experience what a big topic this is, what an important topic it is when it comes to sight, because I myself have had some pretty significant eye problems. I mean, you can tell looking at me, I wear glasses, but I have a lazy eye, which you probably can also tell sometimes looking at me. If you're wondering, where exactly is he looking? It's not my fault. It's that eye that's so lazy. But I, because of that, have eyes that don't work together. Because as a young child, your eyes are supposed to focus in the same spot and work together. And I'm preaching to the choir. You all know that because most of you experience that. I don't. If I go to, I remember being at one of these 3D movie type things, and it was computer animated, and I remember being in the audience, and I had the glasses on like everybody else that are supposed to give you 3D vision, and everyone is, wow, moving around because everything looks like it's, and I'm just looking, it looks blurry. What a nice blurry screen we have in front of us. But it was fascinating to see how everybody else's eyes worked while mine didn't. And on top of that, because my eyes don't work together, I actually, and you may not know this looking at my glasses, but I actually have two separate prescriptions. And I have one eye that's nearsighted and one eye that's farsighted. So, there is an advantage though. If I need to look closely at something, I just look out of that one eye. If I need to look far away, look out of the other eye. But glasses help with all of that. So this subject of eye problems is near and dear to my heart. I know what it's like. But that's in a physical sense we're talking about. The disciples, if we think about the disciples, they had eye problems too, but their eye problems were spiritual. Jesus had said in Mark 8:18, having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? So they had eye and ear problems. This is what Jesus said to the disciples when he was on the boat with them after he had asked them or told them to beware the leaven of the Pharisees. And they were misunderstanding what he was talking about. They were not on his wavelength, we looked at last week. And he says to them, having eyes do you not see? They were not able to see what they were supposed to see. Even though physically they had eyesight, that was fine. Spiritually, they were unable to see things clearly. And remember when Jesus said this, do you have eyes to see and ears to hear? We had read not long before that Jesus had literally taken a deaf man who could not physically hear and given him the ability to hear and speak again. And in this section, after Jesus asks him this question, he now is going to encounter someone who is blind. He's encountered the deaf, now he encounters the blind. So the first major point here is physical sight given. It says in Mark 8:22, they came to Bethsaida. Bethsaida means the house of the fisher, which is very fitting because this is actually the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. And you remember what Jesus said to some of the disciples. He knew that they were fishermen, right? And this place where they lived, Bethsaida, was known for being a fishing community. And he said to them, I will make you fishers of men. Right? He took their occupation that they were fishermen and he said, I will make you fishers of men. So that's the way in which Jesus called these men, some of them being from this town of Bethsaida. So they're back in this area. And it's interesting as we encounter this miracle that this is actually a miracle that only is recorded in the book of Mark. Just like the miracle that we read about the deaf man is only recorded in the book of Mark out of all the other Gospels. So perhaps Mark wanted to give some very vivid individual illustrations about hearing and seeing. And I think that's important for us to pick up on, that Jesus heals a deaf man, and we get to see that scene up close and personal. Now we get to see the scene up close and personal of him dealing with a blind man. In Bethsaida, some people brought to Jesus a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid hands on him, he asked them, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." And Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. And he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Similar to the deaf man, we actually see something Jesus does here. He takes him aside from everybody else. When Jesus is in the village, people would have been around him, but now Jesus sets him aside. That's what he did with the deaf man. He took him away from the crowd. Also with the deaf man, Jesus used saliva. You remember how he used his spit. And once again, we see Jesus using spit. So Jesus is doing some similar things here with both of these men. And it's also noteworthy here, and something people can often wonder about, is when Jesus heals this man, it actually takes time for this man to receive his sight. It's not immediate. And one commentator says that the healing of the blind man of Bethsaida is the only miracle in the Gospels that proceeds in stages, rather than being immediately affected. And another commentator says that this is very much being done in such a way to give us a parable. When you read this story, it's actually very much telling a story that we're supposed to understand about sight. Because we know if God wants to restore sight immediately, he can do that. But he doesn't always do that. But if you look here in Luke chapter 18, verse 35, as Jesus drew near to Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. Hearing a crowd going by, he inquired what this meant. They told him, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." And he cried out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And those who were in front rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and commanded him to be brought to him. And when he came near, he asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" He said, "Lord, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Recover your sight. Your faith has made you well." And how quickly did his sight come back? Immediately. If Jesus wants to heal someone immediately, he can do that. Immediately, this man recovered his sight and followed him, glorifying God, and all the people, when they saw it, they gave praise to God. However, the man at Bethsaida is healed in stages. First, he sees a little bit, and he says, "I see men," probably the disciples standing around. They're like trees, walking. So he's kind of seeing things. And then Jesus proceeds to help him further, laid his hands on his eyes again. And when he opens his eyes again, it says he saw everything clearly. Now, when Jesus did this, he also asked a question. And that's interesting too, because Jesus says, "Are you able to see?" And again, all of this is being done very intentionally. In the previous passage, he has asked the disciples a question, "Do you understand?" And Mark is leading up to another question that Jesus is going to ask. So notice this, that when someone is blind, in this case, this person's physically blind, Jesus asks the question, "Are you able to see?" And the man at first doesn't see everything clearly, but eventually does see more clearly to the point that he's able to see perfectly. Jesus also, in this passage, completely restores this man's sight, which is also, I want to say, very important, because we have here, once again, another verifiable miracle. By the end of this very short episode, this man did not have to go home for days, did not have to follow any kind of ritual. Jesus, within a matter of moments, gave this man his sight back. And you could tell the difference between someone who couldn't see and couldn't get around and had the stigma of being blind, and someone who now, Jesus actually had to say to him, don't even go back to the village. This man now is capable of walking on his own back to the village. This is another verifiable miracle, unlike what we sometimes see today, that there are people who say there are healings that they're doing, but you can't verify many of those healings. These are verifiable miracles. And I talked about that a few weeks ago, so if you want to go back and listen to the message in more detail. Can God do miracles today? Absolutely. But when he does it, it is not a trick. It is something that you can verify and say, that is a change that has taken place. And I gave the example of a pastor who received his voice back. Verifiable miracle. He does not allow the man to go back to the village when he completely heals him. Jesus has a mission that he's on. He has something he is trying to accomplish. That's going to actually unfold in the coming verses, and we're going to see that this week and next week. A turning point is actually being reached in Jesus' ministry here. His public ministry in Galilee is over at this point. It will no longer take place in this area. He's already been in more of the Gentile regions, but this is the end of the Galilean portion of his ministry. And there is going to be something completely shifting now in his focus. And as he's at this moment in his ministry, he tells the man, don't even go back to the village. Even though this miracle had been done, once again, we see that Jesus is not interested in merely drawing crowds or having some sort of healing crusades. He has a very intentional mission he's come to do. And it would be very easy for people to misunderstand Jesus' goal and Jesus' identity. And so Jesus tells the man, don't go back to the village. But he gives this man physical sight. That's the first point. Number 2, we see spiritual sight given. Jesus went with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Now this is in verse 27. As we start on this section here, we recognize, based on what Jesus had asked the disciples, do you not understand, that they're similar actually to the blind man. They are not able to see very well. They're not the only ones, though. But they are certainly ones among many that are not able to see Jesus and who he is very clearly. There's been a process of understanding taking place, though. Little by little, and you remember, if you go back and you think about when Jesus calmed the storm when they were in the boat, they said, who is this who can even calm the storm, command the weather? They're in awe of this person. But they're having a hard time fully understanding. And so not long before, when Jesus says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees, they're actually worried about, do we have enough bread? And they just saw Jesus feed thousands of people. But they're starting to understand. And so it says here that as they're going towards the villages of Caesarea Philippi, on the way, Jesus asked them a question. Now, Caesarea Philippi is 25 miles north of Bethsaida. So they've just been in Bethsaida where they saw the blind man healed. And they're walking for 25 miles. And on the way, and that was, of course, very common for them, normal for them. I think if we had to walk 25 miles, we'd probably be complaining a bit. If it was just to get from one place to another to get something done, right? But that's what they were doing. They're on their way, continuing to do ministry, walking for 25 miles. And on the way, Jesus asked them a question. James McGowan says that Caesarea Philippi is not the same Caesarea encountered previously on the Mediterranean coast, but a rather beautiful city near Mount Hermon. Here, a marble temple stood, built by Herod the Great to honor the Roman Emperor Augustus. And while in this region, far from Jerusalem and amid many Gentiles, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" So he asked them to begin with, "Who do people say that I am?" That's what he first wants them to consider and to be able to echo back to him. Who do people say that I am? Because he's getting to a fundamental issue here. It's really a deep, deep question. Who really is Jesus? Who really is Jesus? The fundamental truth is coming to understand the identity of Jesus. And there were certainly various conceptions of Jesus at that time. And certainly could be misperceptions at that time. But the same is true today. If you ask people who Jesus is, even today, probably with the disciples, you're going to get a variety of answers if you're looking around and you're polling different people's opinion. Certainly at this time, before we have the completed New Testament, and people are still seeing what Jesus is doing, there's a lot of question mark as to who he really is. They didn't really know what to make of him. And so when Jesus asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" the disciples' answer is, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. Now, these answers are probably not the answers you're going to hear today. People still may have a misunderstanding of Jesus, but they're probably not going to say he's John the Baptist. But remember, John the Baptist had been martyred. And we read actually earlier that Herod heard of Jesus. His name had become known. And some said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said he's Elijah. Others said he is a prophet like one of the prophets of old. So Mark has already been telling us that people have been saying these things. But even Herod himself actually was really worried that Jesus was somehow John the Baptist raised from the dead. Why? Because Herod had put John the Baptist to death, and his conscience was plaguing him. But people thought maybe this miracle worker, this amazing person is somehow John the Baptist come back, some powerful figure. Who's another powerful figure in Jewish thought? Elijah. Why Elijah? Well, there were other prophets that were amazing. There were other men that were highly regarded like Moses and David. But Elijah was unique. Why? Well, if you know the story of Elijah, you know he's kind of unique about the way his life ended. Because what's typical is you read, just like today, that someone lived their life and then they passed away, they died. But with Elijah, it doesn't ever say he died. It says he was taken up to heaven in chariots of fire, right? So people are thinking maybe he's Elijah. And remember, one of the prophecies of the Old Testament, I have it up here, Malachi 3. This is the end of the Old Testament. I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. The Lord whom you will seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. This is a messenger who will prepare the way for the Lord. People are thinking, is Jesus that messenger who prepares the way? And what does it say in Malachi 4, the next chapter? Verse 5, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. Now the truth is, there had been an Elijah figure who had come and prepared the way. John the Baptist was that man. But the people were still trying to figure all this out. And they thought perhaps that literally, maybe it's literally Jesus is Elijah come back. Because Elijah had gone into heaven in the chariot of fire. Maybe now he has come back. This is another misperception. Another option that they were considering is, well, maybe Jesus is one of the prophets. Now, the prophets were highly regarded, and they maintained their writings in the Scriptures. I know this is a bit of a history lesson, but by the time Jesus was on the scene, hundreds of years have actually passed since Malachi, the final prophet of the Old Testament. And they were waiting, hoping for God to send a prophet. Why? Because Moses, that's not it there. I guess I didn't put the reference there, but I'll read it for you. It's Deuteronomy chapter 18. And this is Deuteronomy 18:15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. And verse 18. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. So what is the thought of the people? Moses had said that God would send a prophet. And they've had prophets that they have taken the words of the Lord and they have written them and they have preserved them. But it's been a long time. Maybe God has finally sent a prophet, as Moses said he would. And now we can listen to God's word. Well, they were kind of on the right track. Jesus is a prophet, isn't he? But he's much more than that. So why, maybe we would ask, when we think of Jesus, many of us already know that Jesus is called the Christ or the Messiah. So why weren't the people necessarily saying, oh, he must be the Messiah? Well, it's because in their minds, the Messiah meant certain things. They had certain expectations. And one of the greatest expectations is the Messiah will bring Israel deliverance from all of its political enemies. And they, I believe, noticed that Jesus wasn't really doing that for them. He didn't seem to be about that particular mission. And so Jesus was not fitting their expectations of what they thought the Messiah would be. So Jesus is helping the disciples to assess what everybody else is saying and to consider for themselves what they personally think. It involves thinking, assessing, listening to what others are saying, but then ultimately determining for themselves, who do you say that I am? And that's his follow-up question. Okay, that's what everybody else is saying, but you've been following me, you've been watching me, you've been listening to me. Who do you say that I am? And we read here in verse 29, Peter answered him. And he is answering on behalf of all the disciples here. Peter's quick to speak, but he also is a leader. And he is speaking on behalf of them all. And here's what he says. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Now, when we hear that, at this point in the gospel, in light of everything that's been happening up to this point and how hard it's been for the disciples to understand, there's a part of us that should want to clap at this point. Finally, they're starting to get it. They just finally proclaimed this reality of Jesus' identity. You are the Christ. And think about that. What an epiphany that is. They had to let go of their preconceptions. Just like all of the other people around them had these expectations and thoughts, they had to be willing to consider, what is it we're observing? Not what are people saying, but what are we actually seeing? And when they considered it for themselves, their only explanation, their only answer, based on what they have observed personally, is, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. And I'll tell you, just like today, when someone gets to a point of seeing Jesus in this way, it alters the entire perspective. A person's life changes when they begin to see who truly Jesus is. We see it over and over. We see it in the disciples. We see it today. When someone can come to a point and say, Jesus is the Christ. That's why one of the things Paul says about salvation is that we proclaim that Jesus is Lord. When you believe, when you proclaim, when you confess Jesus as Lord. Because what you're saying is, I understand who Jesus is. He's not an equal. He's not like other men. He is Lord. He is over all. He is Messiah, Christ. Christ is not his last name, right? It is his title. You can say Jesus Christ, but you can as easily say Christ Jesus. Jesus, the anointed one, the Messiah. That is what Peter says. It is a pivotal moment in the narrative. It is a turning point. One of the commentators said it is a continental divide in this book of Mark, when you go from everything up to this point to everything after. But I'll tell you, even though this is pivotal for the disciples, it's not the end of their journey. It's not the end of their development. And so that leads us now to consider what we read first about the man who was given sight and what the disciples are experiencing. And I want to think about now the fact that when God opens their eyes, and for us too, when he opens our eyes, this can be a process. This can be a process. And so my final consideration today is for us to think about the process of receiving sight. We are blind. We are blind. In and of ourselves, a blind person, physically of course, can't see, but they also have this problem with their social context. And in their day, especially in Jesus' day, if you were blind, there was a stigma about that. Oh, you have that condition. You weren't looked at favorably if you were a blind person. We also have a condition, and it affects our interaction with others. It affects how they see us. It affects how we see ourselves. Do we really want everybody to know everything about us? Because we're so perfect? Do we really want that? The truth is, we feel this sense of stigma and alienation. We have a very hard time opening up about everything that we really are. And we have a very hard time seeing things the way we should see them, especially on a spiritual level. So 3 points of application here about the process of receiving sight, because we all need to receive sight. We're blind in our sin, and we need sight. And here's the first point. God is the one who gives us the power to see. God is the one who gives us the power to perceive and see. I think I had it up there. Jesus, when he asked this question in Matthew 16, who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And here's what Jesus says in response. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. You are so smart. You finally got it. No, he says, that wasn't you. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. It was not you. It wasn't human power. It was the power of God. That's how you saw it, Peter. God opened your eyes. God opened your eyes. Paul says something similar. Even if our gospel is veiled, they're proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. He says, some people can't see it. It's veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. And so he's talking here about how even Satan is doing his work in keeping us blind. So is there any hope? Verse 5, what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God who said, and we know in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, he said, let there be light. God has the power to give light. It says, God who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. What God did in creation, God can do in our hearts. What God did in creation, God can do in the human heart. If God can bring light to the universe, he can give light to our hearts so that we can see in ways we could never see before and understand things we could never understand before about who he is and about who his Son, Jesus Christ, is. God gives the power for us to perceive. Remember last week, I used the analogy of being on the same radio wavelength in order to receive and to be able to understand things. But you know what? Just to take that analogy further, because I want to beat it into the ground. A radio, even if you say, okay, and I know some of our phones have the ability to receive radio signals. Can this phone do that? Well, theoretically, a radio can receive the signals. But it has to have power. It can't do it if it doesn't have a power source. And it's the same with us. If we don't have the power source supplied by God, by the Holy Spirit, we're not going to be able to see. We're not going to be able to receive. We're not going to be able to perceive. The reality is there. Are there radio waves around us right now? Of course. Do you hear them? No. Well, maybe some of you. But we can't hear them unless we have something that gives us that connection. But that has to have a power source. It's true with our lives. If we're going to be able to receive the things of God, it has to be by the power that God supplies. We do not have that power in and of ourselves. That's very important because a lot of us, we get discouraged because we think, I don't know. I don't know if I can do the Christian life. Well, here's what I would say to that. You can't do the Christian life. Only God can do it through you. But that is the joy. That is what we're so blessed to understand, that it is God doing it. So God gives the power for us to perceive. Number two, sight can come in stages. And when God does his work in our lives, we see it's in stages. And like the disciples, at this point, they understood, according to what Peter said, you are the Christ. There are people today who would say the same thing. If you ask them, what do you believe about Jesus? They would say, Jesus is the Christ. I've talked to people who've said that. You ask them, what do you believe about Jesus? And they can give you what I call a Sunday school answer. They know it's like the right answer you're supposed to give. But the question is, do people understand Jesus' true nature and his mission? The disciples, remember I titled this, Beginning or Starting to Understand. We're going to see next week that they didn't completely understand. They started to understand, and they could get to the point where they said, yes, you're the Messiah. We can't deny what we've seen. But they still don't really understand his mission. They don't understand everything about his identity. And that's how people today can be. That's how we can be. So the good news is, though, that these stages are the way God builds so that we can go from one part of the process to the next. Remember the blind man? He could see a little bit, but it eventually brought him to the point where he can completely see. And so one stage of sight paves the way for another. I was reading about the great scientist Newton. Many of you know who he is, right? And Newton gave theories and mathematical computation concerning the law of gravity. And I was reading that his theories and his concept of gravity even made it possible to explain and predict the tides. This is what one website was saying. His theories made it possible to explain and predict the tides. The rise and fall of the ocean water levels are created by the gravitational pull of the moon as it orbits the earth. Now this is fascinating because we observe these things and we look at what's happening around us, but when we have a scientist like Newton, Isaac Newton, and he says, you know what? Maybe this is what explains it. The concept he came up with was basic. But what it did is it gave us the ability to start to see everything, to start to see why there's planetary motion, to start to see why there are tides that the way there. Everything starts to make sense. But it starts with that basic understanding. And it's the same with our ability. It starts with basic understanding. We go from one level of sight and perception to another. And at least that's the hope. The hope is that you're growing in your knowledge. As children, we start with fundamental concepts, and then our understanding increases over time. I remember actually as a child talking with my father, and I was learning. I would go to school and I would learn things. But I would be at home and I would ask my dad a question, and he knew everything. My dad knew everything. Now, did he really know everything? Yes, he did. No. I just told you. To me as a child, it seemed like because where I was at, I couldn't even imagine knowing as much as he did. I couldn't imagine it. Because his level of understanding had increased over year after year after year. In our Christian life, you don't see everything right away. It starts at one level, and it builds, and it builds, and it builds. And God gives you greater and greater ability to see. And then thirdly, and this is also very important, number 3. So remember, God gives us power to see. Sight comes in stages. And number 3, don't assume you see things perfectly. The disciples were starting to see, but they did not see perfectly yet. One writer said that Peter sees, but it's the equivalent of walking trees when he says Jesus is the Christ. It's still blurry. It's still blurry. Now, do you acknowledge that Jesus is the Christ? Great. But maybe there's still more for you to see. What does it entail when you say that Jesus is the Christ? We need to know who he is, but we also need to know what that means. Okay? We can say the words, but what does it mean for him to be the Christ? This has to do with our knowledge and our response. So the response right now with the disciples is good. Because they've at least gotten to this point where they can say, you are the Christ. But next week we're going to see a response that's not good. The disciples, here's how I would put it. They understand, kind of. Kind of. They kind of understand. And you know what? That's probably us too, more than we would like to think. We can read about the disciples and it took them so long to get this stuff. But listen, when we read about the disciples, we're also reading about us. Don't assume you know things perfectly. Allow God to continue to give you sight. It's very humbling. But realizing that like that blind man who couldn't see, and he had to go through this process, we have to go through a process too. and we're still in that process. I pray that God will help all of us to continue to recognize that He is giving us sight, but we have more to learn. We have more to see. We need to see more clearly, and only God can help us see clearly.